Okay, thanks everyone. My presentation is on the subject of community safety initiatives in Kenya's informal settlements and on measuring impact. So it's a presentation in two halves really. I can talk a little bit about how we measured the impact of our intervention in Kenya, but I'm going to have to do that in a more expansive way and dip into other interventions we've done as well. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the context in these areas we've worked in. And I need to paint a slightly broader picture as well and tell you what's happening in Kenya to make sense of that, I think. I'll give you 2 minutes on why you're hearing from someone who works for a demining organization in the first place. It's slightly puzzling. Then I'll get into the project itself, and then I'll talk about measuring impact. So, Kenya today, 40% of Kenyans are living in urban areas, and about half of those, according to UN Habitat, are living in informal settlements. This is mostly in Nairobi, but also in other cities. And it has the highest growth rate in informal settlements in the world, according to UNESCO. There's about 6% per annum growth. So there's a lot of rural-urban drift going on. And it's driven by all sorts of background issues in the country, which you may know about, and of course which are similar to many of the other contexts we're hearing about. We've got land injustice, there's inequality, political impunity, there's massive unemployment, and so on. Kenya had a new constitution passed some years ago, I think it was 2010, and it promises a lot. It really offers Kenyans a different dispensation. There are checks and balances on the presidency and the executive at the center. There's police and judicial reforms. There is devolution to local counties. These boundaries you see here are entirely new to Kenya, 47 new counties with local legislatures, devolved power on most services, health, water, education, and so on. And very important, revenue being pushed down to those counties from the center. This is all entirely new. But some years down the line, we're seeing a lot of pushback and delays in implementing this, and in some ways, in these informal settlements in Nairobi, not a lot seems to have changed, unfortunately. So we've done a project last couple of years in two settlement areas in Nairobi. One is called Mathare, the other is called Korogocho. There's a picture of Mathare. It looks okay on a sunny day, but it's not great living in Mathare. It has almost a 50% crime victimization rate if you look at national studies that have been coming out the last couple of years. So, almost half the people per annum are subject to some kind of interaction with crime, probably a petty theft, sometimes with force used. Similar rates in the other location, Korogocho. Gangs are operating with complicity with police, marketing themselves to politicians, moving drugs, moving guns, and controlling a lot of the services that people want. You can't get water without paying for it at extortionate rates through one of these gang channels. The garbage dumps are a livelihood source for a lot of people, but they're also controlled by these networks. You can't build a shack without paying someone, etc., etc. And the gangs are attractive also to young people as a source of employment, but also protection from the police and from others. So a lot of the issues we've been hearing about earlier in different presentations, you'll find them in this location. Okay, this is about Danish Demining Group. A little bit of a sidetrack. Why are you hearing from me in the first place? Well, Danish Demining Group obviously does this stuff. We take these things away and destroy them when we find them in communities around the world. But we've gradually come to realize that actually public safety problems are broader, and it's not just about bombs and mines, it's also about guns, but it's not just about guns, it's about institutions, it's about attitudes, and so on. So we've gradually, I guess, drifted towards doing much more armed violence reduction work, that's the language we use, dealing with people like this, police and communities, and so on. Yeah, a couple of presenters have shown us some kind of conceptual framework that they use. The crime prevention framework we just saw was one. We've been using this OECD DAC armed violence reduction framework, which people like Rob are very familiar with, which helps you think about things in terms of institutions, agents, and instruments. So I guess we moved from purely working on instruments to realizing there's a wider, more complicated world out there. But we still work very much at that local level, which is playing to the strengths of a demining organization, which has a lot of staff who are familiar with field work. This project in the two settlement areas in Kenya, what we decided to do was try and adapt some of our community safety methods from rural areas that tend to be affected by mines, guns, conflict, bombs, and so on, into this dense urban area with gangs and the public safety issues I've been describing. So we took the two most affected areas within Mathare and Korogocho, according to statistics. We hired some volunteer workers to identify at-risk youth for us. And of course, they picked them up by talking to a lot of different stakeholders. We told them we wanted people who were either immediately involved in criminal activities or on the margins of that. It could be involved in a support network or something like that. But we weren't able to deal with gang leaders or anything like that. So we ended up working with 60 young people between 15 and 25 years old. 10% of them were willing to openly talk about their ongoing engagement in illegal activities. Many more would allude to it, but we were fairly clear that a lot of these people describe themselves as hustlers. That was the word they used. I mean, they're in and out of informal activities, legal, illegal, all the time. So one day they're picking up some work on a building site, next day, they're moving some drugs for a local gang, that kind of thing. And most of them are male. Some of them were female as well. They might be girlfriends or wives of gang members. They might be part of a support network, and so on. The sort of profile we're looking at was primary education at best, and often a background with disrupted family history, some trauma issues, substance abuse, and so on. And what we found in working with these young people was, I guess you'd expect it, but very limited awareness of their legal rights, despite this new constitution, which has been made a big deal of in Kenya. Deep contempt for national institutions, particularly the police, but not stopping there. I mean, people were very alienated from any government institution you could think of. And really, part of our method involved trying to help them think through their future. But that was something entirely new. People were, of course, living day to day. And the idea that you could have a plan or a vision or change things for yourself was something quite new. So what did we do? As I said, we started with that community profiling. We hired some volunteers. Then we identified these participants and engaged with them to get them to sign up on a clear basis. And we began with some initial trainings to start things out and kind of change attitudes and build some cohesion amongst the group. So trainings on managing conflict and your emotions, communicating better, some basic life skills, and also some stuff around firearms. But all of this was designed to aid communication, enable them to work as a group or think through their future. And we used role plays, interactive discussions. Some of them made documentaries about themselves, and they would show them to each other and discuss. Storytelling, so very interactive methods. And this culminated in what we were calling youth empowerment plans. So each individual and then the group had a plan to move ahead, change their lives a little bit, whether that was, it could be anything in the plan, could be getting back into contact with your family. There was a lot of business, entrepreneurial stuff in there, educational stuff, learning to use computers, all sorts of different things. And then we gave them a little bit of support to implement those plans. What did we find a few months later? Well, we found we'd had about 15% dropout rate across the board. We had about 50% of the remaining group who had implemented all or most of their plan at that point. That was about 6 months later. So of course there could still be plenty of activities to implement and all sorts of problems along the way, but about half were we're getting on reasonably well with that. When we measured some of the attitudinal behavioral changes that we'd taken a baseline on at the beginning, we saw pretty good attitudinal change continuing. Behavioral change was harder to track, actually. I mean, we got a lot of anecdotal stuff around that and case stories from the individuals. But I think some of the learning from this was that the community-based approaches can work at that level. But I would, being asked to wrap up, but I think, you know, that it's not just us working in these locations. There's plenty of other stuff going on, some of which works, some of which doesn't. And I think not enough of this is documented and shared. There's a need for much more coordination, but also integrated strategies in Kenya. But just going back to that national context, unfortunately, a lot of what is tried falls foul of political competition, corruption, institutional malaise. So taking anything to scale beyond these interesting pilots or NGO-led projects is pretty difficult in Kenya. As soon as something's picked up by national government, it tends to wither a little. The great hope is really the county governments, which are going to be a lot closer to ordinary people, have revenue attached, and hopefully provide more accountability. All right, Lorenzo, just 2 minutes on measuring impact, if I may. I mean, DDG's developed an intricate, we call it change pathway. I mean, it's a theory of change for this kind of work. So we're trying to clearly establish what it is we're looking for at different levels of a change model. And from that, then we can design indicators and think about the different collection methods. So, you know, if we're looking at changes in relation to governance of people's safety and security, then some of the indicators there would be number of safety activities where government participates, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, you know, there's lots of different ways of doing this, but I think starting with clarity over your theory of change, the change pathways, and being committed to measuring at different levels whether that path is being followed by the activities you're undertaking, I think that's quite important. I think it's also quite important, and other people are obviously doing it, to look at new technologies. A lot of the data we collect, or a lot of the evidence that is out there, is not in an accessible form. And we all know you have a very hard time influencing policy using evidence. Policy isn't really made based on evidence. I think the Colombia example is a fantastic one for that. So the more that we can do to make this evidence accessible through kind of mobile phone tools or online tools like this is a tool we're developing to track armed violence across the region. I think this is really important. And just to finish up, I mean, I think I would say that the challenges to measuring impact or doing M&E, they're not really technical as far as I can see. You know, given time and commitment, you can collect this data and make it part of an M&E framework. I think the challenges are more things like cost, attribution, politics, as we saw. You know, are people interested in this? Are they willing to let you collect it in the first place? And what will they say about it once it's released? And also, I think, national capacity. People have talked a lot about local government capacity. But getting this kind of data collection into the national systems, having it routinely collected, shared, analysed, and discussed to implement, to affect policy, I think is critical. Okay, I'm going to finish with a picture of some smiling kids. Thank you very much.